In 52 BC, within the fortified settlement of Avaricum in central Gaul, 40,000 men, women, and children were trapped behind massive stone and timber walls, praying the freezing winter rain would halt the Roman war machine. The Gallic defenders trusted their seemingly impenetrable geography, an island of elevated ground surrounded by deep, treacherous marshes that actively neutralized the mobility of the opposing heavy infantry. They believed the harsh environment and their towering defenses would save them, completely unaware they were about to become the victims of the most systematic and ruthless massacre in the military career of the Roman proconsul Julius Caesar. This was a siege where the landscape itself dictated the terms of survival, forcing the legions to achieve through raw manual labor what they could not achieve through standard tactical maneuvers. When the fortifications finally fell, the outcome was absolute. Out of the 40,000 people trapped inside the oppidum, fewer than 800 would survive the edge of the Roman gladius. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the siege of Avaricum, examining the sheer scale of Roman engineering, the punishing environmental pressure, and the chilling moment when military discipline transformed into total annihilation. But the seed of this disaster was not planted at the walls of the city. It began weeks earlier with a desperate, scorched earth gamble that went terribly wrong. By early 52 BC, the fractured tribes of Gaul had finally united under the command of Vercingetorix, a chieftain who deeply understood the grim reality of fighting the Roman Republic. He recognized that engaging Julius Caesar's veteran heavy infantry in a conventional pitched battle was a tactical death sentence. The Roman legions were an unparalleled close-quarters fighting machine, but they possessed a critical vulnerability. An army of tens of thousands of men, along with their auxiliary cavalry and draft animals, consumed massive amounts of grain every single day. To exploit this logistical tether, Vercingetorix enacted a ruthless, systematic, scorched earth doctrine. He ordered his coalition to destroy their own homeland to save it. Across the countryside, the acrid smoke of burning Gallic villages and granaries rose thickly against the freezing winter horizon. By denying the Roman supply lines any local forage, the Gallic commander intended to starve the legions into a desperate, disorganized retreat. Over 20 regional centers were voluntarily reduced to ash in a single day, effectively transforming the landscape into a barren wasteland that could not sustain an invading army. However, Vercingetorix was a coalition leader holding together a fragile alliance of fiercely independent tribes, not an absolute monarch with unquestioned authority. His grand strategic vision collided violently with tribal politics when the Scorched Earth campaign reached the territory of the Bituriges. Their tribal chieftains fell to their knees and pleaded with the Gallic commander to spare their capital, Avaricum. They argued that the oppidum was not only the wealthiest settlement in the region, but that its unique geography and formidable stone defenses made it virtually impregnable. From a purely military standpoint, sparing the city violated the core logic of the starvation strategy, offering the Romans a potential, highly concentrated stockpile of surviving resources. Yet, to refuse the Bituriges risked fracturing the precarious tribal unity upon which the entire rebellion relied. Forced to balance ruthless military logic against the immediate political demands of his allies, Vercingetorix yielded. He reluctantly agreed to exempt Avaricum from the flames, anchoring a substantial garrison within its walls to bolster the local defenders while pulling his main coalition army back into the surrounding wilderness to harass Roman foraging parties. This single political compromise provided Caesar with an exact geographic target, funneling the entire momentum of the Roman war machine toward the gates of the Bituriges capital. The Gallic commander knew Avaricum was a trap, but even he could not predict the terrifying lengths to which the starving Roman legions would go to crack it open. When Julius Caesar arrived before Avaricum, he did not face a conventional battlefield. The oppidum was essentially an island fortress, entirely surrounded by a vast network of deep rivers and freezing stagnant marshes. For the Roman legions, whose absolute battlefield supremacy relied on deploying heavy infantry into rigid interlocking formations on solid ground, this terrain was an operational nightmare. The swamps actively neutralized Roman tactical doctrine. There was no room to maneuver, no flanks to exploit, and no way to launch a multi-pronged assault. The geography funneled the entire Roman war machine onto a single, narrow land bridge that connected the city to the surrounding plains. By forcing the legions into this severe choke point, the Gallic defenders effectively stripped Caesar of his tactical advantages, demanding a direct frontal confrontation on the worst possible terms. Yet, the true genius of Avaricum's defense stood at the end of that narrow approach. The city was protected by a masterpiece of indigenous engineering known as the Murus Gallicus, or Gallic Wall. This was not a simple palisade or a rigid stone barricade. The Gauls constructed a complex interlocking matrix of massive timber beams laid crosswise, filling the interior gaps with earth and rubble, and facing the exterior with tightly fitted dry stone. This composite structure was explicitly designed to defeat standard Roman siege tactics. The thick layer of stone shielded the timber from incendiary arrows and fire-throwing artillery, while the deep, flexible timber lattice absorbed the intense kinetic impact of Roman battering rams without shattering. When the heavy iron head of a Roman ram struck the wall, it did not crack the structure. The energy simply dispersed harmlessly into the densely packed earth and wood. The supreme commander found himself trapped in a lethal geometric equation. His heavy infantry could not bypass the swamps, and his siege engines could not break the wall. A prolonged blockade was impossible, as Vercingetorix's scorched earth campaign had already stripped the countryside bare, leaving the Roman supply lines completely empty. Starvation was already beginning to erode the physical endurance of the legions. Realizing that conventional siege warfare would only result in the slow death of his own army, Caesar made a brutal calculation. If the wall could not be battered down and the city could not be starved out, the Roman legions would have to manually alter the geography of the battlefield. To reach the impenetrable wall, the supreme commander ordered his starving men to do the impossible. They would not breach the defenses. They would build a mountain to step over them. The scorched earth doctrine, implemented by Vercingetorix, was systematically achieving its primary objective. The Roman supply lines had completely collapsed. The allied Aedui and Boii tribes, either unable or unwilling to spare their own dwindling resources, failed to deliver the promised grain shipments to the besieging army. Caesar's elite heavy infantry, the most lethal fighting force in the Mediterranean, was reduced to severe malnourishment, forced to subsist for days entirely on meager rations of tough cattle driven in from distant unburned pastures. The physical toll of operating under a severe caloric deficit was heavily compounded by the hostile environment. The heavy sucking mud of the freezing marshes relentlessly gripped the legionaries' boots as they hauled massive timber trunks from the surrounding forests to the siege lines. Recognizing that the absolute operational limits of his army were rapidly approaching, the supreme commander made a highly unusual proposition. He addressed his legates and centurions, formally offering to lift the siege and withdraw from Avaricum entirely if the physical hardship had become too great for the rank and file to endure. The response from the legions was a stark testament to the iron core of Roman military psychology. These veteran cohorts, whose pride and institutional honor had been forged across years of grueling campaigns in Gaul, outright rejected the offer. They sent word back to the command tent that abandoning a siege was an intolerable humiliation, demanding instead to remain and avenge the Roman civilians who had been slaughtered by the rebellion weeks earlier at Cenabum. Fueled by this rigid martial pride, Caesar ordered the full-scale commencement of the Ager, a monumental siege terrace explicitly designed to bridge the chasm between the marshy ground and the towering Gallic defenses. What followed was an agonizing display of raw manual labor and structural engineering. The Roman legions were tasked with constructing an artificial mountain that would eventually measure 330 feet wide and reach a staggering height of 80 feet, rising perfectly level with the top of the Murus Gallicus. The mechanical discipline of the Roman war machine took over. Operating in continuous shifts around the clock, the starving soldiers assembled a massive, complex lattice of heavy timber logs, painstakingly filling the interior gaps with thousands of tons of earth, stones, and bundled fascines. However, this colossal engineering juggernaut possessed a severe tactical vulnerability. Because it was constructed primarily of wood and dry brush, the siege terrace was inherently flammable. As the leading edge of the agger crept agonizingly closer to the enemy fortifications, the Roman laborers entered the lethal range of the Gallic defenders. From their elevated vantage point on the stone walls, the tribal garrison poured a constant, harassing barrage of javelins, stones, and incendiary darts down upon the exposed Roman sappers. The legionaries were forced to work under the protective cover of heavy mobile sheds, absorbing the localized attrition while slowly extending the ramp foot by foot. The massive Roman ramp slowly crawled toward the stone walls, but deep beneath the mud, the Gallic defenders were digging a lethal trap of their own. The Bituriges were not merely tribal warriors, they were highly skilled iron miners, intimately familiar with the mechanics of subterranean engineering. Recognizing the sheer crushing mass of the advancing Roman agger, they did not passively wait for the timber mountain to crest their walls. Instead, they excavated deep, reinforced tunnels beneath the muddy terrain, driving directly under the operational footprint of the Roman siege terrace. The objective was catastrophic structural failure. The Gallic sappers hollowed out massive caverns beneath the Roman position, intentionally propping the earthen ceilings with dry timber supports that had been heavily coated in pitch, animal fat, and highly combustible resins. At the stroke of midnight, the trap was violently sprung. The Gallic miners set their subterranean supports ablaze. As the foundational timbers burned away and snapped, a massive section of the Roman terrace suddenly sank. Plumes of acrid smoke erupted through the widening cracks in the agger, immediately followed by sheets of fire igniting the dry brush and fascines within the core of the Roman structure. For Julius Caesar, this represented an absolute command crisis. The timber ramp was the singular tactical linchpin of the entire Gallic campaign. If the agger was reduced to ash, the legions, already severely weakened by weeks of malnutrition, would possess no alternative means of breaching the oppidum and no supplies to sustain a fighting retreat. The destruction of the ramp equaled the eradication of the Roman army. Capitalizing on the sudden structural failure and the localized chaos, the garrison of Avaricum launched a highly synchronized, multi-tiered counterattack. From the heights of the Murus Gallicus, defenders hurled blazing pitch, dried wood, and incendiary darts directly onto the exposed Roman siege towers, actively feeding the inferno. Simultaneously, the heavy timber gates of the city swung open. A massive wave of Gallic infantry executed a desperate night sortie, surging out to strike the Roman forward positions. The tactical geometry became exceptionally lethal. The Roman sappers and frontline cohorts found themselves defending against an aggressive close-quarters infantry assault in the dark, while the very ground beneath their boots actively burned. The crisis demanded immediate, unyielding discipline to prevent a total frontline collapse. Standard Roman military doctrine dictated that two cohorts always remained fully armed and assembled on watch directly outside the encampment. These veteran reserve units instantly mobilized, rushing into the illuminated kill zone to plug the fracturing gaps in the defensive perimeter. The engagement devolved into a vicious grinding night action. While the heavy infantry locked their scuda to repel the Gallic sortie, and methodically pushed the defenders back toward the city gates, Roman engineers frantically hauled raw earth and wet hides forward to smother the subterranean flames. The legions absorbed heavy casualties in the tight, chaotic press of bodies, strictly prioritizing the survival of the siege engines over their own tactical safety. Through sheer mechanical perseverance and rigid unit cohesion, the cohorts slowly suffocated the fire and stabilized the terrace foundation. The Roman engineering survived the night of fire, but as the ramp finally touched the height of the enemy walls, the ultimate decision rested on a sudden, violent shift in the weather. Following the stabilization of the siege terrace, the Roman engineering marvel finally reached its intended dimensions, standing 80 feet high and perfectly level with the Maurus Gallicus. The logistical and physical chasm between the two forces had been bridged. Yet, the final assault was not initiated by a formal trumpet blast, but by a sudden and severe shift in the environment. A brutal freezing downpour descended over the Avaricum basin, dropping temperatures drastically and severely restricting visibility across the front line. In ancient warfare, weather of this magnitude was a definitive tactical barrier. The freezing water saturated the timber defenses and, crucially, soaked the sinew strings of the Gallic bows, effectively neutralizing their ability to lay down defensive missile fire. The tribal garrison, exhausted from weeks of continuous vigilance and the punishing night sortie, observed the deteriorating conditions and made a fatal operational assumption. Relying on the conventional logic that no army would attempt a coordinated heavy infantry assault blindly in freezing rain, the Gallic sentries abandoned their exposed positions along the parapets. They withdrew into the sheltered stone guardhouses to escape the cold, leaving the primary defensive perimeter dangerously thinly manned. From his command position, Julius Caesar recognized that the severe weather was not a hindrance, but the ultimate tactical cloak. Rather than ordering his men to stand down and seek shelter, the supreme commander orchestrated an immediate, high-risk offensive. He understood that the element of surprise against the formidable Gallic wall was only possible if the Roman war machine functioned exactly when the enemy deemed it impossible. He issued rapid orders to his legates, quietly shifting his assault cohorts from their encampment to the base of the massive timber ramp. The contrast between the two armies in this decisive hour was absolute. While the tribal coalition broke their watch for the comfort of shelter, the Roman heavy infantry demonstrated the terrifying extent of their martial discipline. Thousands of starving legionaries assembled in the freezing mud at the foot of the Ager, locking their formations in utter silence. The heavy rain actively masked the clatter of their iron armor and the creaking of the siege towers being pushed into final position. At a single muted command, the veteran cohorts advanced methodically up the incline. They did not break into a charge or raise a battle cry. They moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency, completely undetected by the garrison below. The Roman legions crested the undefended wall in silence, and in that moment, the tactical engagement ended and the slaughter began. Once the vanguard cohorts of the Roman heavy infantry crested the Maurus Gallicus, they did not succumb to the chaotic bloodlust typical of a breached city. Instead, driven by the rigid tactical doctrine of the legions, they immediately executed a highly coordinated perimeter sweep. Rather than diving into the labyrinth of narrow streets below, the centurions directed their men laterally along the broad top of the fortifications. The element of surprise had granted them an uncontested foothold, and within minutes, the dark silhouettes of Roman legionaries were methodically spreading out, systematically securing the defensive towers and the mechanisms of the main gates. Below them, the awakening tribal garrison frantically attempted to mount a coordinated defense. Realizing the walls were lost, the Gallic chieftains rallied their surviving warriors and funneled them into the wide open expanse of the city center. In accordance with their own martial traditions, they formed a massive, tightly packed shield wall, fully expecting the Roman infantry to pour down from the ramparts to engage them in a conventional close-quarter street battle. the Gauls stood ready in the freezing rain, their weapons drawn, prepared to meet the Roman charge head-on and fight for every inch of their capital. But the Roman charge never came. Caesar's veterans recognized the lethal geometry of the battlefield and refused to surrender their newly acquired high ground. From their elevated vantage point on the Murus Gallicus, the legions simply formed an unbroken ring of iron and wood around the perimeter, their javelins leveled at the streets below. By occupying the entire circumference of the wall, the Romans fundamentally inverted the defensive architecture of Avaricum. The towering fortifications that the Bituriges had so desperately relied upon to keep the Republic out were suddenly transformed into an inescapable cage, locking 40,000 men, women, and children inside. As the Roman blockade solidified, a profound psychological terror rippled through the gathered Gallic ranks. The tribal warriors, standing shoulder to shoulder in the market square, watched as every avenue of retreat was systematically sealed by Roman shields. When it became undeniably clear that the legions had no intention of engaging in an honorable melee, and that the only exits from the oppidum were now commanded by hostile heavy infantry, the Gallic shield wall spontaneously fractured. The unified defense collapsed into absolute, terrified panic as warriors threw down their weapons and scattered, desperately seeking a way out of a city that no longer had any doors. With the gates permanently sealed and the high ground completely secured, the Supreme Commander unleashed his starving, exhausted veterans to claim their reward. The Roman heavy infantry descended from the Murus Gallicus into the narrow streets of Avaricum, but their primary objective was not plunder. In standard Roman warfare, a captured urban center represented a massive financial windfall, as the surviving population was systematically processed and sold into the Mediterranean slave trade. At Avaricum, however, the economic incentive of taking captives was entirely overridden by sheer military exhaustion and a deep, collective desire for retribution. The legions had been pushed to the absolute limits of human endurance, having suffered through nearly a month of severe starvation, freezing weather, and grueling manual labor in the hostile swamps. Furthermore, the ranks seethed with bitter fury over the sudden tribal uprising and the recent unprovoked massacre of Roman merchants at the town of Cenabum. Driven by this compounded rage, the soldiers completely ignored the lucrative prospect of taking prisoners. The ensuing operation was not a chaotic, disorganized riot, but a highly systematic eradication of human life. Maintaining their strict unit cohesion, the veteran cohorts advanced block by block, clearing the oppidum with a cold, procedural efficiency. They made absolutely no distinction between armed warriors, the elderly, women, or children. Julius Caesar, who routinely exerted strict authoritarian control over the actions of his men and the distribution of spoils, allowed the complete annihilation of the city to proceed unchecked. For the Supreme Commander, the destruction of Avaricum served a calculated geopolitical function. It was deployed as a weapon of absolute terror, intended to send an unmistakable message to the rest of the fractured Gallic tribes. Armed resistance against the Republic would result in total demographic erasure. The statistical reality of the siege's conclusion was staggering. Of the 40,000 Gauls who had sought sanctuary behind the supposedly impregnable timber and stone defenses, almost the entire population perished within a matter of hours. The Roman perimeter remained incredibly rigid, but the sheer scale of the settlement allowed a tiny fraction of the defenders to slip through the closing vise. Desperately wading through the freezing, pitch-black marshes under the cover of the ongoing storm, fewer than 800 survivors managed to escape the Roman cordon. Exhausted and traumatized, they eventually reached the distant camp of Vercingetorix, carrying the grim details of the city's destruction. Caesar had wiped a city from the map to break the spirit of the rebellion, but this atrocity would achieve the exact opposite result. Caesar intended the annihilation of Avaricum to fracture the Gallic coalition through sheer terror, but the geopolitical reaction was entirely the opposite. When the frozen, bloodied survivors staggered into Vercingetorix's encampment, the Gallic commander did not hide them. Instead, he weaponized their tragedy. He paraded the refugees before the allied chieftains, using the horrifying reality of the Roman massacre to definitively prove that his deeply unpopular scorched earth strategy had been correct all along. Avaricum was the undeniable evidence that attempting to defend a static fortress against Roman heavy infantry, no matter how formidable the walls or the geography, was a fatal miscalculation. The eradication of 40,000 citizens shifted the parameters of the conflict from a localized rebellion into a war for total national survival. For the previously hesitant tribes of Gaul, the message was no longer about paying political tribute to the Senate. It was a stark choice between complete victory or absolute extermination. Rather than shattering Gallic morale, the massacre galvanized it. Tribal leaders who had previously refused to join the uprising now committed their warriors to the coalition, granting Vercingetorix an unprecedented level of absolute political and military authority. The Roman Republic had demonstrated that it would enforce its will through uncompromising, mechanical violence, inadvertently forging the very unified enemy it had sought to prevent. The tactical triumph at Avaricum temporarily solved Caesar's immediate logistical crisis, flooding the Roman camp with desperately needed grain and supplies plundered from the ruins. Yet, strategically, the extreme brutality displayed within those walls guaranteed that the remainder of the campaign in 52 BC would be an unforgiving fight to the death. The geopolitical stage was perfectly set for the ultimate showdown, propelling both armies toward the defining siege of Alesia, where the fate of Gaul and the future of the Roman Empire would be permanently decided. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.